One of my favorite things about college football each year is how different players can jump to the top of statistical categories. Uh, an example is from this past year, Ashton Genty having a crazy season, nearly breaking Barry Sanders' rushing record. So in today's video, I'm going to be going over the players that led the NCAA in statistical categories last season and a few players that I think have a chance to lead that statistical category this coming season. Also, everybody remember to subscribe if you love sports, and don't forget to share with people who you think would be interested in this topic. When looking at passing yards, Kyle McCord, who transferred from Ohio State to Syracuse this past year, had 4,779 yards to lead the nation. He had a fantastic season, but who's next? A few players who I think have a decent chance at it are Cade Klubnik. He's coming off of a season with 3,639 yards in 2024, and he returns his top receiver, which is a big deal. Josh Hoover is coming off of a season where he threw for 3,949 yards, and TCU threw the ball all over the field last year, and so I foresee a lot of the same this year. Garrett Nussmeier threw for 4,052 yards in 2024, and he's looking to run it back. LSU has also had very, very talented receivers the past few years, and so it's looking promising for Garrett. But the player who I feel most confident could be able to lead the nation in passing yards next year is actually Carson Beck. So Carson Beck threw for nearly 3,500 yards in 2024, but in 2023 at Georgia, he threw for 3,941 yards. And he just barely transferred to Miami, where Cam Ward threw for over 4,300 yards. So I think the offense will play well to Carson Beck's passing ability, and I think he's a good quarterback who will throw for a lot of yards this year. Speaking of Miami and Cam Ward led the nation in passing touchdowns with 39. A few players that I think have a chance to lead the nation this year are, number one, Arch Manning. He doesn't have a huge sample size, but he threw for 9 touchdowns on only 90 attempts, a 10% passing touchdown rate. Texas has talented receivers, and Texas as a whole threw for 40 touchdowns last season. So I think Arch has a great opportunity to lead the nation. The second player is Sawyer Robertson. He had 28 passing touchdowns last year, including 27 in the final 10 games of the season. In those final 10 games, he threw for multiple touchdowns in every single one except for one. So 9 out of the 10. And the final player that I think has a shot in this situation is Julian Sayin. He's seen as the likely starting quarterback for the Ohio State Buckeyes. And the reason why I think he could be a dark horse for this is because he has a guy by the name of Jeremiah Smith, who I think, we'll get to him later, but I think he is the best receiver in the nation. But the player who I think is most likely to throw for the most passing touchdowns this year is Cade Klubnik. He's coming off of a great season, throwing for 36 in 2024, being just 3 shy of the nation's leader. And he's coming back, and his top receiver, Antonio Williams, who had 11 touchdowns last year, is also coming back. And I think Clemson is poised for a solid year with Cade Klubnik at the helm. When looking at rushing yards, Ashton Genty absolutely dominated last year, going for 2,601 yards in 2024. Boise State will definitely be looking to replace him, but here are some players that I think could replace him on top of the rushing yards leaderboard. Number 1 is Jamal Haynes. He's a running back for Georgia Tech, and between the past 2 seasons, he's ran for a combined 2,000 yards I think he's a very talented running back, and Georgia Tech's a pretty run-heavy team. So I could see him doing quite well. The next player that I think has a shot at it is Mekhi Hughes. He's a really good running back who played for Tulane the past couple years, going for nearly 1,400 yards both seasons, including over 1,400 yards this past year. He transferred to Oregon, where Oregon's top rusher last season went for over 1,200 yards, and I think Mekhi Hughes has a chance to have a similar season. We'll see if that's good enough to lead the nation or at least be close. But the player I think is most likely to lead the nation in rushing next year is Jeremiah Love. He ran for 1,100 yards in 2024 on nearly 7 yards per carry. And this season, he will probably, in my opinion, get more touches in the backfield due to no longer having Riley Leonard in the backfield to compete with him with those touches. Riley Leonard, their quarterback, ran for over 900 yards last year. I also really quickly want to mention that I think Penn State has a really good duo of running backs, but I think having both of them will make it difficult for either one of them to dominate statistical categories in terms of just sheer rushing yards or rushing touchdowns. But they're really good running backs. In terms of rushing touchdowns this past year, while Ashton Jeanty dominated and racked up 29, he still didn't lead the nation. Bryson Daly, the quarterback for Army, who had a really good season this year, ran for 32 touchdowns in 2024. And so here are a few different players that I think have a chance of leading the nation this year. Number one is Mekhi Hughes, who had 15 touchdowns in 2024 and is going to a very talented Oregon team. I could see him having a lot of success for a successful offense in Oregon, where if they're able to get it down to the goal line, he's a good, solid running back who I think could punch it in plenty of times. The next one is Kanye Udo, who is transferring from Army, where he had 10 touchdowns in 2024, to Arizona State. He'll be playing in a different kind of offense, but I think Sam Levitt is a very talented quarterback that can move the ball effectively, and Kanye Udo is a good, solid running back who I think can punch in plenty of touchdowns for the Sun Devils. Another guy who I think has a shot at it is Devon Dampier, who is transferring from New Mexico to the University of Utah. He had 19 touchdowns in 2024, which is the top returning player from last year. A reason to think he might be able to is the fact that the University of Utah has some really, really good offensive linemen, none better than Spencer Fano. The reason to have some doubts about him, though, is the fact that he's jumping up from the Mountain West to the Big 12 level. So we'll see how he does. I think he'll be successful, but I don't know if he'll be able to replicate his 19 touchdowns from last year. The player who I do think has a good chance at replicating his production from last year is Jeremiah Love. Once again, Jeremiah Love is right on top of this leaderboard. He had 17 touchdowns in 2024, showing that he has a nose for the end zone already. And he loses his quarterback, who racked up 17 rushing touchdowns. So I think he'll have a lot more goal line opportunities and red zone opportunities, and I think he's going to cash in for a lot of touchdowns this year. In terms of receiving yards, Harold Fannin, who I made a video about a few months ago, finished this season leading the nation with 1,555 yards, which is absolutely insane to do as a tight end. A few players who I think could do it this year are, number one, Ryan Williams. He was a freshman phenom going for 865 yards for the Alabama Crimson Tide in 2024. I think he's just going to build off of this as he did this on over 18 yards per catch. And he also went off for 177 yards against Georgia. Another player who I think could lead the nation is Jordan Tyson, who went for over 1,100 yards for Arizona State, and he returns his very talented quarterback Sam Levitt this year. The next player who I think has a shot is Antonio Williams, a very talented player that we talked about briefly when talking about Cade Klubnik, who had 904 yards in 2024. And like I just mentioned, he returns Cade Klubnik, his very talented quarterback, which I think will be very helpful in him having a great year. But ultimately, a guy who I mentioned briefly earlier is who I believe will lead the nation in receiving yards this year, and that's Jeremiah Smith. Jeremiah Smith is an absolutely dominant player, and as a freshman at Ohio State, he went for 1,315 yards on over 17 yards per catch. Last year, Nick Nash had 16 touchdowns for San Jose State to lead the nation in receiving touchdowns. This year, I think Jacoby Lane has a chance to do it, as he had 12 touchdowns last year, and he has a great 6'5" frame to be a phenomenal red zone target. Another player who I could see leading the nation is Jordan Tyson, who we talked about before. He had 10 touchdowns in 2024, and he returned Sam Levitt. Antonio Williams had 11 touchdowns in 2024, and again, he returns Cade Klubnik. So he's going to be primed for a great season. But ultimately, the player who I expect to lead the nation in receiving touchdowns is Jeremiah Smith, who came in second last year with 15 touchdowns as a true freshman. He's got a big 6'3" frame, and he's extremely talented in the red zone and all over the field. Last year, Mike Green led the nation in sacks with 17 for Marshall. This year, Dylan Stewart has a shot at it, as he had 6.5 sacks as a freshman in the SEC. He's a long defensive end with good athleticism. Another player who I could see leading the nation in sacks that might be surprising is Logan Fano, the Utah defensive end. Utah lost its top sack getter last year, and even though Logan Fano only got 2.5 sacks last year, Utah has a great history of defensive ends racking up the sacks. Since 2014, there have been 5 double-digit sack seasons by Utah defensive ends. The most recent of which being Jonah Ellis racking up 12 in 2023, although Bradley Anae had 13 in 2019 and Nate Orchard had 18.5 in 2014. But ultimately, the player who I think has the best chance at leading the nation in sacks this year is TJ Parker, who had 11 sacks for Clemson last year. He also had 6 forced fumbles, which is just insane. Last year, Sean Dolak led the nation with tackles with 168, which is just insane. This year, a couple of players who I could see leading the nation is number 1, Stone Blanton, who had 124 tackles in 2024, and he plays in the SEC, which is known for power football. Jacob Rodriguez for Texas Tech had 127 tackles last year, and so he's primed to rack up some tackles this year as well. But ultimately, the player who I expect to lead the nation in tackles, and assuming he stays healthy, this might be the strongest I feel about any of these, is Red Murdoch. Red Murdoch was a teammate of Sean Dolak at Buffalo, and he had 156 tackles to come second only to his teammate. I don't know what they're feeding the linebackers there in Buffalo, but to have 2 linebackers combined for over 300 tackles is insane. Noel Williams had an incredible season for the Cal Golden Bears, racking up 7 interceptions last year. But here are a few of the players who I could see leading the nation in interceptions this year. Number 1, Jameer Latimer, who had 3 interceptions in 2024, but he transferred to Wisconsin, which may make it more difficult to rack up interceptions as he's going against better quarterbacks and better receivers. Next up is Mansour Delane, who had 4 interceptions in 2024, and he transferred to LSU. The next one is Caleb Downs, who only had 2 interceptions in 2024, but he's an absolute star for the Ohio State Buckeyes. So there's no doubting his ability to rack up more than 2 interceptions this year. Jalen Catalon had an incredible 5 interceptions for UNLV this year, but he transferred to Missouri, so we'll see how that transition goes. And Isaiah Glasker, who had 3 interceptions for BYU last year, is an incredibly rangy 6'5" linebacker. So he can easily get in passing lanes. There's no doubt he'll rack up some interceptions in 2025. But ultimately, the player who I expect to lead the nation in interceptions, this one being probably the most iffy of all these predictions, just because there are so many different players who rack up interceptions, and interceptions can be hard to come by depending on the situations that they're placed in, is Tyree Skipper. He had 4 interceptions in 2024 and 3 in 2023. He returns to Louisiana for another year, and he's got a good size as a 6'2" safety. Let me know who you think will lead the nation in these statistical categories. Tell me if you think I got these totally wrong or if you think some of these are good guesses. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.